The Bleeding Bow Gladiator is a build I wasn't really sure would be very good at first glance, but I could not have been more wrong. This build has insane defensive layers as well as respectable clear and some pretty insane single target, all while being able to freely move around as the damage is done. Hey guys, I'm Big Ducks, and in this video we're going to go over the Bleeding Bow Champion or Gladiator, whichever you'd prefer, that I've been playing recently on stream. Remember, if you'd like to see more content, the best way that you can do that is to like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel for the latest updates on Path of Exile, ARPGs, and whatever other games just happen to catch my attention at the time. Remember that you can find examples of me playing builds just like this one live over at twitch.tv/bigduck, so make sure to follow me over there so you can see when I go live. And last but not least, if you want to be part of the community, make sure to join my Discord channel, link down below. I'm always over there talking, doing carries, just hanging out with people and answering questions. So feel free to join. You can ask me questions on pretty much whatever you'd like. Now, before we begin with the actual guide, let's take a look at some of the things that this build is capable of. Remember, the timestamps are available to the different sections of this video in the description, as well as in a comment below this video for mobile users. Let's go over some of the pros and cons of this build. Starting out with some of the pros, it has very solid single target while being able to move around easily. It has quite solid clear that doesn't require you to stick around for it, and also you have a choice between two separate abilities. This build has some of the best defenses that I've seen on a non-block or tank build through the use of the Divine Flesh Keystone while stacking Chaos Resistance. The build is hardcore viable as you do get a ton of life, heavy resistances, and armor, and you take very little damage from most sources. As for the cons, this build can be slightly expensive to scale towards boss melting DPS. A few of the items can cost well over a couple Exalt. However, you don't need these to play the build. The build is not exactly solo self-found friendly if you aren't ready to do a lot of crafting, and some of the uniques are relatively rare in solo self-found. It also takes quite a bit of chaos resistance to function like you'll see in the clips in this video. So we have a choice between two main skills that we can use for clearing this build. You can either use Split Arrow or you can use Vol Rain of Arrows. For Split Arrow, this is mainly going to be focused on the Gladiator version once you obtain the chest piece. Before you obtain the chest piece, or if you're going with the champion, you can feel free to use Vol Rain of Arrows. They both use the same exact links. Those links are Chance to Bleed, Brutality, Vicious Projectiles, Swift Affliction, and Deadly Ailments. Keep in mind that of all of the gems that you would like to upgrade to Awakened, Swift Affliction, when it is upgraded to Awakened Swift Affliction, has one of the best qualities available for this build. Each 2 quality will provide you 1% more damage over time. We also use a separate skill for single target, and that will be Puncture. The links for Puncture are Chance to Bleed, Brutality, Vicious Projectiles, Swift Affliction, and Deadly Ailments. The same goes for Awakened Swift Affliction for this ability. Now beyond that, we do have a third ability that is quite useful for clearing and for single target for a little bit more difficult mobs, and that is Ensnaring Arrow. Ensnaring Arrow is linked to Ballista Totem, Maim, and Greater Multiple Projectiles. The reason that Ensnaring Totem is so strong for this build is that while a mob is considered ensnared, it is considered to be moving at all times, and as we know, bleed does much more damage while moving. As for defensive gems, we use Vol Molten Shell. I suggest that you put your regular Molten Shell on your left click because as you move around, it will consistently use it, and then put your Vol Molten Shell on somewhere that you can use whenever you need it. For our movement ability, we're going to be using Dash, linked with Second Wind, and Blink Arrow. Dash is going to be your main ability just to move in and out of combat, and Blink Arrow will be for if you need to move longer distances. As for auras, we use Flesh and Stone, War Banner, and Malevolence. Flesh and Stone both provides us some defensives and offensives depending on which mode that you're in, and allows us to stack Challenger charges through our Ascendancy. Path of Building is a free offline character building tool designed by a member of the GGG team that allows you to fully test and customize your character. You can find links to Path of Building, instructions on updating to the community fork, as well as an import link for this character in the description below this video. Our tree focuses on gaining as much life as possible while scaling physical and bleed damage. We extensively use cluster jewels in this build and also the Lion's Fall unique jewel to convert the nearby axe and sword bleed base nodes into bow nodes. Starting out, you'll want to head out through the attack speed and grab life nodes as you head towards our first goal of Resolute Technique. As we continue, you will fill in more health as well as slotting in Lion's Fall so that you can begin to pick up the nearby damage nodes to the left. Moving on towards the end of the campaign, we continue filling out life and pick up our first purely bleed nodes. Note that you can start filling in cluster jewels at any time around level 50, but unless you're going to transition directly into bleed damage early on, it's not fully suggested. Speaking of cluster jewels, our endgame tree has us filling in all of them, as well as slotting in a glorious vanity in the name of Jibakwa to convert half of elemental damage taken into chaos. I'll go over this in more detail in the item section of the build. As for our Ascendancy, this build functions as either a gladiator or a champion. The gladiator is ultimately what I decided on in the end, as it provides much better clear and movement speed. However, for the average player, the champion is far tankier and gives a much safer playstyle, more suited for players who want an easier time playing or want to play on hardcore. Starting with the gladiator, we begin with Arena Challenger. This provides us drastically increased movement speed as well as kill speed, simply for using the Flesh and Stone aura and killing monsters. Next up is Blood in the Eyes. This gives us maim, blind, and more damage done to bleeding enemies, as well as some chance to bleed. Next up is Gratuitous Violence. This is the main reason that we go gladiator. It provides us a very powerful clear buff in that bleeding enemies will explode for 10% of their maximum life, as well as providing us more damage with bleeding. Outmatch and Outlast is our final node, and this gives us a chance to gain charges on kill. However, bleeding doesn't count for this, so to make full use of this, you can either use Blood Rage or minimum endurance charges on your jewelry. If you intend to choose champion, understand that your clear speed will be heavily nerfed, and you will be required to use the Hemophilia gloves or an Explodey chest to maintain decent clear. However, you will be far tankier due to Fortify and damage reduction, as well as the adrenaline and the heal that it provides. Our first node is First to Strike, Last to Fall. This is a solid choice for leveling, as it provides us a safety net from one-shots and permanent intimidation while we're playing solo. Unstoppable Hero is next. This node provides us solid damage and defenses, as well as giving us stun immunity. I generally suggest that if you're going the champion route, simply wait until you can do Merciless Lab to obtain this node, as we have no solid way to obtain Fortify while using a bow. And once you can get to Merciless Lab, you can obtain Fortitude. This gives us Fortify permanently. It's pretty good. And last is Conquer. This gives us a 100% chance to taunt on hit, which will allow us to tank for party members, as well as gives us damage reduction, life regeneration, and damage reduction for our allies. For Bandits, we will kill them all. Skill points are at a premium for this build. For the Pantheon, our major soul, I suggest taking Soul of Solaris. This gives us a solid reduction in damage taken. For the minor soul, Soul of Shakiri synergizes extremely well with our use of the Divine Flesh Keystone, and it will provide us a significant reduction in damage taken. Now as for actually playing the build, this build focuses on abusing the bleed mechanic for maximum profit on single target. The way that bleed works is that if you apply a bleed, they will roll their damage over time based upon the physical damage of the hit that caused them, meaning that if you roll high end on your damage, you will do a stronger bleed. And when you apply a stronger bleed, it will overwrite weaker bleeds that came before it. This, in combination with the modifier on our bow and our belt, provides us with heavy single target damage over time. Bleeding also causes significantly more damage to targets that are moving, and luckily for us, Ensnaring Arrow causes targets to always be considered moving. By putting this ability on a Ballista Totem, it allows us to maximize our clear and single target damage while being able to move consistently to avoid other damage sources. While leveling, I suggest that you focus mainly on damage done and ignore bleed in the early game for the most part. Level with Split Arrow until you can obtain Rain of Arrows at level 12, and then continue with Rain of Arrows until you can obtain the endgame chest piece, at which time you'll want to swap back to Split Arrow if you're deciding to go with the Gladiator. Otherwise, you can continue with Rain of Arrows. While mapping, you'll make liberal use of Split Arrow and Rain of Arrows, and upon running into high life packs, you can drop your Ensnaring Totems to help your DPS output. For any stronger mobs, you can apply a single Puncture as well. Bossing, however, will rely mainly on the use of our Puncture ability. Drop your Ensnaring Arrow Totems around the boss and repeatedly fire Punctures into the boss looking for a high roll of damage. You will absolutely know it when you see it. Once you obtain that bleed, you can completely focus on dropping totems and dodging abilities while your bleed does its job. Now, the gear for this build is in the moderate to expensive range. You can do most maps and the majority of easier bosses with lower end gear, but for very high end bosses, the most expensive expensive gear is suggested. We also are going to be mainly focusing our gear around obtaining very high chaos resistance to be used with the Divine Flesh keystone, provided by Glorious Vanity, as well as Dexterity, Life, and Elemental Resists. Our weapon is the main barrier to entry for this build. It requires a crafted Citadel bow with 60% chance for bleeding inflicted with this weapon to deal 100% more damage. A Citadel bow is ideal because of having the highest top-end damage, which synergizes well with the bleed mechanic. The end goal here is to obtain this modifier as well as a damage over time modifier, and then multi-mod with increased physical damage and added physical damage. You can get away without having the damage over time multiplier, but you will need the base bleeding mod as well as high physical damage to see solid results. We have two in-game body armor options that are dependent upon which Ascendancy you're playing. If you're playing the Champion, an Explodey chest is ideal in this slot. You can combine it with any other solid modifiers you're looking for, such as health and resists. If you're playing the Gladiator, then the Lionized Vision chest piece is ideal here. It provides us the Pierce Link, which will allow us to transition into Split Arrow, as well as solid life, armor, and mana leech. Alternative to these, you can simply use any solid 6-link rare you can find on the trade website until you're able to transition. For helmet, we're looking to find a rare with Dexterity, Life, Chaos Resistance, and an open suffix to craft Elemental plus Chaos Resist. A Starconges is a unique option, but is not suggested for the final build, as Chaos Resist will come at a premium, and we need to reach 150 total Chaos Resist from our setup. As for an enchant, the ideal enchant for this build is Dash has +2 cooldowns. This gives us an insane amount of movement and dodge ability that we need while we wait for our bleed to do its job. Alternatively, you can look for Puncture or Split Arrow damage, as well as Split Arrow fires 3 additional projectiles. If you are playing the Champion, you can also opt for any of the Rain of Arrows enchants. Remember, helmet enchants are not important. For our boots, we're looking for stats, life, elemental and chaos resist, and high movement speed. It is important to focus on the high movement speed portion in this slot, as it is the main defensive mechanic for our build to be able to move quickly to avoid skill shots while our bleeds do their damage. As for enchants, the only useful one for the most part is 0.6% of damage leached as life if you have killed recently. For the glove slots, we're looking for Hunter Influence gloves with plus the physical damage over time multiplier, added physical damage to attacks, life, and chaos and elemental resistances. In the belt slot, we have 2 options. Any rare belt with life and resists is one of them. However, ideally, we're going to be looking for the Rislatha's Coil belt with 20% attack modifier catalyst quality. This belt is one of the more important slots for our damage, and it gives us essentially another link's worth of damage in the high end. As I stated earlier, the main thing we're looking for is to high roll bleed applications, and this is one of the major ways that we do that. The catalyst quality affects the more maximum attack damage as well as the physical damage to attacks. This belt can be expensive, but is well worth the cost. In the amulet slot, we're looking for a hunter influenced amulet with dexterity stat base. On this amulet, we're looking for physical damage over time multiplier, life, and resists. My suggested anointment is Deadly Draw. It provides us heavy damage while only requiring the silver oil at the top end. Alternatively, for a cheaper option, you can take Entropy, which only requires a crimson, or for a more expensive option, you can use Growth and Decay, which requires a golden. In the ring slot, we are looking to obtain the majority of our elemental resist, as you'll have to pay a premium in the other slots to obtain chaos and elemental resistances, as well as high life. We're also looking for life and an open suffix to craft elemental and chaos resistance. If you're playing the champion, this is a slot that you can look to obtain mana leech on if you are having mana difficulties. Our flasks are going to be all magic and consist of a quicksilver for movement speed, a quartz flask for phasing, which allows us to easily move through packs as our bleed finishes them off, a life flask of your preferred type, a jade flask to supplement our evasion, you can also use a basalt flask here if you prefer, and a granite to provide us additional armor to scale Molten Shell. We look to obtain freeze, bleed, curse, and ignite immunity, as well as the adrenaline suffix on these flasks. Jewels are one of the most important factors of this build, as a large amount of our damage and sustain comes from well-rolled cluster jewels. For those cluster jewels, we're going to use a single large, 2 mediums, and 2 small cluster jewels. Attempt to get the lowest possible amount of passives on each of them. Remember that there is no difference between the absolute lowest and one above lowest for large and medium jewels. For large cluster jewels, we're looking to find one with 2 medium cluster jewel slots as well as physical damage rolls. Some ones to look out for are Master the Fundamentals, Battle Hardened, and Iron Breaker. Medium jewel slots provide us a ton of damage, and we're looking for physical damage over time multiplier base jewels with a small cluster jewel slot. Some nodes to look out for are Exposure Therapy, Vivid Hues, Disorienting Wounds, and Rend. For small jewels, we're looking to mainly obtain life jewels with the Feast of Flesh notable. If you're playing the champion and are having mana difficulties, you can opt to use one of the Daring Ideas or Improviser nodes instead. For standard jewels, we're using Lionized Fall, one of the other required items for this build. It allows us to transform the axe and sword nodes on the bottom left of the tree into much needed bleed and bow nodes. We also use a Glorious Vanity in the name of Jibakwa in the bottom left jewel slot that transforms Iron Grip into Divine Flesh. Now, while this isn't exactly required, the build is based around using this for a massive source of defenses. It gives us 10% increased maximum chaos resistance and converts half of all elemental damage taken into chaos damage. This makes us mostly immune to chaos damage and significantly immune to elemental damage. We're also looking for a rare jewel jewel with the corrupted implicit, corrupted blood cannot be inflicted on you. Any other stats here are fine. Of note, the jewel slot at the bottom of the tree can be used with the Thread of Hope jewel of varying sizes to obtain quite useful nodes that would otherwise take too many travel points. This is a build that I thought was kind of a meme, but it turned out to be one of the most solid builds I've played in some time, and made me reconsider how viable bleeding is as a mechanic. It took on pretty much anything I threw at it with ease. There are some major barriers to entry item-wise, but once you get past those, it becomes a solid build for clearing tier 16s, endgame bosses, and pretty much anything else that you want to throw at it. Remember, if this guide helped you out, make sure to like the video and also subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you can get updates on my latest videos. And remember, stay safe out there in Ray class, and I'll see you in the next video.